everyone.
All right.
I think I'm supposed to have a clicker. All right, we'll just go for it. Hi. Unfortunately, Eric Gordon wasn't able to join us today, so I will be helping to moderate instead. I'm hoping that this will just be an informal conversation. We have a few points that we're hoping to hit, and then at the very end, we'll save 10 minutes for questions. I want to introduce everyone on this panel. Briefly, my name is Melissa. I'm a civic designer and researcher at the Engagement Lab at Emerson College, and I am very interested in the co-creation of immersive safe spaces using VR. And this project started as my graduate thesis at Emerson College. Next to me is Jennie Jewell, who is an actress, dancer, and assistant manager at Logixhealth. In 2014, she was incarcerated for 2 years after a traumatic experience hitting a man with her car while under the influence. While incarcerated, she joined Moving Steps Foundation, a nonprofit that uses dance and theater for transformative healing for women who are recovering from addiction and/or incarceration. Today, she serves as one of Moving Steps' lead choreographers and teachers, and she was an actor for one of our episodes on addiction and temptation. And then we have Lynn Lazar, who is the Deputy Superintendent of South Middlesex Correctional Center, the only minimum security / pre-release women's prison in Massachusetts. She's been working at the DOC, Department of Correction, for over 14 years. At one point or another, Lynn has worked with every Massachusetts state prison, with men, women, and gender nonconforming folks, as well as folks who are pre-entry, incarcerated, and newly released. This project was originally Lynn's idea. And lastly, we have Barry Pousman, who is an award-winning XR producer who filmed the seminal piece, Clouds Over Cedra, while working as the chief digital strategist for the United Nations. He's the co-founder of Variable Labs, who produced a salary negotiation simulator for women and immersive HR training content for companies including Google. He is currently the digital strategist at the Institute for the Future and continues to produce groundbreaking immersive media. Barry led the production and post-production of this project. So the first part of this, I want to give you all some context of the problem, the potential we see for XR, and some ethical considerations. So first, questions for Lynn. When I started this project, it was 2017 for my thesis, but this project actually has its roots going back to 2016 when VR was first becoming commercially viable. So for Lynn, I wanted to know, what were your first thoughts and what was the need that you saw that led to this project? And what was the potential of VR that you saw?
Okay. In 2016, I was part of a program called Warden Exchange. And for a year, I participated in this program. And one of the events that they had us all go through was a virtual reality tour of a prison. And they said, this is a great example of technology that you can use for, and as they said, staff, I thought inmates. It would help them with reentry. And it's something that I struggle with all the time, working in the department and preparing the men and women, right now, primarily women, with reentry and getting them prepared for a successful reentry. So I brought it back, and we've been talking about it for an awfully long time until we got in touch with Emerson College, who introduced me to Eric and Melissa. And they really took this idea, and we worked as a team. And my goal was to have inmates experience different everyday activities that you and I would go through before they are released, so they have that experience. And the idea was to identify high anxiety provoking activities for them to go through in a safe environment, and do it in a group session so that we can talk, discuss, use coping skills, identify those coping skills, and better prepare them for the release.
Yeah, and maybe, Jennie, you can help give us some context. So some of the situations that cause anxiety are not ones that we might think of normally. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about why reentry is so challenging.
It's challenging because I feel that there's a stigma behind it, and people are more so judgmental than kind of have an open mind on a person coming out of jail. As a human, like, everybody makes mistakes, and I just feel like just people need to just have like an open mind and just not to be so judgmental. And I'm like nervous. This is my first time on a panel, so yeah.
Yeah. The very first workshop that Eric and I ran with Lynn and some other staff at the DOC, we brainstormed 77 different scenarios that were challenging for people. So ranging from, the most common was going shopping, grocery shopping, that could cause anxiety, or seeing your child again for women, especially. So
A lot of we created 2 different focus groups. One focus group was current staff, both the program staff and security staff, as well as we had someone who was an ex-offender, someone who worked in a recovery home, and we had someone who worked in the drug court. So we had a focus group with those individuals. And then we had a second focus group with just inmates. And the inmates, all female, long-termers, short-termers, repeat offenders, a little of everybody in both groups. We had to get the perspective of everybody so that we could really create a very detailed script to be acted out. And these 2 groups came up with 76 different high anxiety provoking experiences. Might be just crossing the street. You and I cross the street, we watch, we look at the signals or what have you, but now someone who's been incarcerated for several years crosses the street. People are on their phones, they're bumping into you, they're crowded around you, a lot more noise. They're not used to so much noise. They're not used to people crowding in so close to you. That alone is very triggering. Or going to some place like a CVS where it's bright, you have music, there's 100 different shampoos, and they've only had a choice of 1 or 2 for a couple years. So those things that maybe we take for granted are things that I wanted to expose them to and get them to have that experience. We can talk about that all we want. They can read about it all they want. But for them to actually go in there and look around using this technology is the difference between good enough and extraordinary. And it was extraordinary what these women went through. It's a pilot program now at Framingham. Yeah. And what was good too is all these different subjects that we came up with, 77 as Melissa said, we could weave them together. So one video, we have a video of temptation where we have Jennie acting in it, has maybe 6 or 7 of those high anxiety activities or events happening. Yeah. So
I want to differentiate this from some of the existing VR exposure work out there. So VR, since the early 90s, has been used for exposure therapy applications and for, I forget, the Institute of Creative Technologies at USC. They're using it for training for soldiers who have PTSD coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq. But one thing that we found in actually talking with people who have lived through incarceration and reentry, often multiple times, is that you can't just show them a scenario and hope that they can practice reentry. It's very much the narrative aspect that's really important. So we really focused on the storytelling. And we wanted to, so we started thinking about how do we do these kinds of storytelling activities inside prison where there's very little access to technology, and there's no Wi-Fi, there's no, you can't bring a phone in.
Nothing at all.
I mean, it's prison, right? So I wanted to share with you all the process that we went through, but I wanted to give Barry a chance to talk a little bit about the VR training work that he's done and how the specifically linear narrative model that he's worked on, the work that he's done has informed ours.
Yeah, of course we all know that if you want to learn something, you should immerse yourself in that thing, that the easiest way to learn a language is to find a romantic partner that speaks that language and spend a lot of time with them. And so, in a way, you just sort of step into that world. You get to embody it. You get to immerse yourself. And a distinction, I guess, a lot of VR creators and sort of the VR industry often looks down on 360 video as a format or a form factor. And I think that there's a lot of value in 360 video, and we've seen a lot of sort of positive outcomes from 360 video. And it's not, a lot of prison reentry and training in particular across the board in VR is really gamified. It's really designed around, you did an action, you get 2 karma points, and you're like collecting to get to 10 karma points or whatever it is, these sort of like game mechanics that get layered in. But that's not how life is. That's not how people experience scenarios. And so I think there's definitely a value in using live action, in using real people that have actually had these experiences that are drawing on their own personal memories to bring that to bear for the people using the VR. So, and actually we have some really interesting stories. I'd love you to share some of the reactions that people had around just briefly, because people, when you watch avatars, of course that's a scalable model. Everyone can type in a script that an avatar on Sumerian could read back. But that's, again, not like reality. When you actually sit in the car with Jennie here, you really feel it. And if you've been in that kind of situation, you feel it especially. So maybe just...
Sure. We had 5 women participate in the pilot program, and what we did is we paired 2 up and the other 3 worked together. And they would have the script in front of them, and as one is watching, the other's listening and following on the script. And one woman was watching this, and she started sweating. She started doing this type of thing and moving around, and she was just getting super anxious. So, of course, I'm watching her very closely. I need to make sure she's safe, and we do all this with a mental health clinician as well, which I think is very important. So she took off the goggles, and she was exhausted. That was me, she said. That was me. That I thought I was prepared. I've run this in my head a million times since being incarcerated. I've talked about ways I'm gonna cope with this or get through this, but I'm not ready yet. After seeing that brought a whole new perspective. I'm not ready. I thought I was, which is fabulous. It's great. Now we know where we need to work from. We had another woman brought up, she was watching the video of Jennie, who did such an amazing job acting in this, and the way Jennie was sort of nodding off in the video, and we had different things planted in the car to show that there was some drug use. And the person watching the video said, I could actually smell the car. I could smell the perfume that was trying to mask the smell of the car. That's how true it was, that they were right there in that car experiencing it. Right. And then it was absolutely amazing.
I'm sorry to cut you off.
Nope, go ahead.
We brought some of the footage. I'm wondering if there's a clicker I could have? Or if someone could click for me. Yep. Go. Thank you. Sorry, I wasn't sure if I missed something. All right, so concretely, I want to show you what we actually did that led to the creation of the 360 videos. So like Lynn said, we had several focus groups. This one was the first workshop that we did with 6 women at South Middlesex. So we brought in, we tried to do a co-design workshop, but completely analog. So how do you design VR when none of your participants have ever tried or even maybe seen a headset? So we broke VR down into its core components. So starting with the actual storyline. This is a 3-part storyboard. So what was the triggering experience? What was the protagonist feeling in that moment? And then how did she overcome it? So we're asking the 6 women to use their own memories or memories of their friends or their peers to write these stories. And so we did this in small groups of 3, so 2 women, incarcerated women, and 1 facilitator. Then we took all their stories, I typed them up. You can see the note-taking template that I gave and how I thought the conversations would go and then how they actually went. So we wrote out the stories, the actual plot line, and then we tried to ask them what the dialogue would be in that scene. And then what do you think, oh, I'm sorry, I'm trying to read it. This is a year ago. What does the voice in her head tell her? But of course, when we ask people to think about their experiences of reentry, they just go off and they're like, well, this person, this parole officer was super mean to me, and and we just go along with it. In the next session, we asked people to actually draw what they would imagine that scene would look like. So the drawing on the left is Kim, whom Jennie would play, who is your best friend. So they wrote out a description of, this is Kim, she's wearing a lot of bling, she's a middle-class user. And they wrote a backstory, like Kim and the protagonist met at an NA meeting when they were both trying to stay clean, and then they started to use together, they were partying. Then they drew out the scenario, they drew out what the people around them would look like, and they were really honest, this is from their own experience. I could have never have written anything like this. That eventually got turned into the script that Lynn was talking about. So we asked people, where should we shoot this? Like Barry was saying, the magic of 360 video is you can shoot on location. So we shot this episode that you're gonna see, hopefully, outside the Lynn, Massachusetts parole office, which is right next to a homeless shelter, right next to a needle exchange. And then you can see the photo in the middle, that was from that shoot. And so Jennie is sitting in the driver's seat, the camera is in the passenger seat. And we brought in another woman, Jen Blaze, who is in recovery for addiction, and to do the set design. So I remember I brought in sugar in a plastic bag, and she was like, you should have used flour to mock up like Coke. And I was like, how would I know that? So we really try to emphasize as much as possible bringing in people who have actually lived through this experience as actors, storytellers, set designers, and when possible, like in their first photo, acting coaches. So the gentleman on the left was not an actor, that was the guy on the right, but he was telling the actor, this is how job interviews were for me. This is what my interview would say to me. These are the looks that he would give me. This is how that made me feel. And then the last photo is the voiceover, so really low budget stuff.
It took you so long there. I was so bored reading.
Whoa, smells like a bar in here. What is she thinking? She's wrecked, and I've only been in there an hour. Hold on, is this a setup? She knows I've been clean for 3 years. I mean, I know she loves me, but this is bad. Wait, she's got drugs in here? Are there any more? I don't want this chaos anymore.
You look stressed. What happened in there? What did your parole officer say?
Don't even worry about it. One officer was just being like real rude to me, like I was some nobody.
You know what? Never mind. Let's go have a drink. I'll get you one too.
Should I do this? I could probably do this. It's just one drink.
Remember when I used to go out? Come on, let's celebrate. You look so good. You deserve one drink, at least.
Yeah, I do remember going out, going to the pink house. We used to have so much fun. I could really use one after that parole meeting. And to be honest, I kind of just want to get high with her. But I know what'll happen next. One drink, one pill will just lead to another.
So that was a video, and the story is you were just released that morning. Your best friend Kim picks you up, and the first thing you do is check in at your parole office. And so while you're there, Kim gets high in her car, and you come back, she offers to buy you a drink. And so if you're in recovery for addiction, what do you do? How do you refuse her? So Lynn had started to talk about how women reacted to seeing this. And maybe you could just share a little bit more about that.
The women all had different reactions, but the underlying goal is it impacted them to the point where they had to take a breath after. And they all discussed it, and that's one really critical part of this, is you need that human element. And we all discussed, oh, how are you feeling? What would you do? They were mad at the driver for coming to pick them up, like in that condition. They didn't know what to do. If I get in the car, I could get violated for parole. If I don't get in the car, what you didn't see is people walking along the street just doing their thing. They looked like there was a fight going on. They looked like there was the needle exchange thing and something happening down there. So there are all these distractions and all these temptations. And they struggled with what they could do and what they should do. And when they first saw this video, it was almost like they were frozen. They couldn't think. They couldn't come up with a decision. Just get in the car and get out of there, some people were saying. But after we talked about it, they said, we actually do have decisions. We do have choices. And the choices, just walk right away, go right back into the parole office. Just know that you're strong enough. Remember where you came from. You don't want to go back there. There's too much to risk. So we had this great conversation where they all could come together and talk about the feelings, the emotions, the triggers, the distractions, all this stuff that's coming up. And at the end of the group, they came up with ways to get out of there in a healthy, productive way. So it was a terrific experience for everybody. They all fidgeted. They all felt uncomfortable. One woman wouldn't look at the driver at all. She said, I couldn't look at the driver. She got a glimpse, and she's like, I couldn't look at the driver because she reminded me of me. And I always thought I was this pretty little thing when I was using, and I had the makeup on, and I had it all together, but I looked at her, and that's what I used to look like, and I'm embarrassed. That was my normal.
Right. I mean, one thing that came out of the pilot was the mental health specialist said conversations that would take weeks with the women took minutes after watching the media. So I wanted to save some time for questions. So I wanted to get into some lessons learned for us. Maybe starting with Jennie and what working on this project meant for you, especially as a creative person and actor yourself.
It's a bit of a challenge because just coming out and just being exposed to this environment, that was really a big obstacle for me to face what I've been through and accept it and just to move on. I feel that what helped me is that, this is my reality. But for me, I don't feel that being in jail was the end of my story. I feel like being in jail started my story and just being a positive outcome. and being that success story that people don't normally see.
Totally. And what, maybe, I'm gonna skip around Barry.
Lessons learned. I think there's something beautiful in the participatory design that you've set up here. I think that often, creators come to solve problems from a pedestal or from afar, and it can be hit or miss. It can be even a disadvantage to the population they're trying to improve the lives of. And so, I think part of the process is really beautiful here, and it's also, it shined a light on some of the things that are missing in the VR workflow, which is to say, of course, we had actresses and actors, we had set designers, we had all these opportunities to include the community that it's really about, but at some point there is sort of a technical gap in that pipeline, and they wrote the scripts. They could potentially, some ran the sound system when it was happening and, held the microphone, the recording devices and stuff. But one sort of link in the chain that's missing in a non-technical way is the editing. And so I think, that might be a place where we could think about as a collective VR creator community, how do we continue to empower communities we want to help through non-technical tools? We also, I think that another place, and I kind of mentioned this before, but just thinking about this urgency of scale that we're all facing, this opportunity for investor money, this opportunity where, I can just have an avatar and he could have all 77 lessons could be created, if I just write in a script and then an avatar does it. I think that, one of the lessons learned here is actually going to the place, being in a place where there is a fight happening outside that parole office. That became one of the things that a lot of women came out of it and felt like, wow, that made it real. Those sort of real life nuances added a lot of texture and value. So I think that those are some of the lessons. Also, we could have done with more of a budget. This is a master's project and really was done on a shoestring and done with as a labor of love by a lot of people. But I think that, projects like this and we are excited about potential opportunities for future funding, but I think, these sort of projects need funding. They need investors to say, we see the potential, we see that, it doesn't just have to be a sort of top-down approach to solving problems. We don't just have to make sort of glossy, beautiful projects that are designed around getting people to give money to problems or influence policy, but actually, from the bottom up, we can address problems individuals at a time and create models for doing that across the country and across the world. So that's another place I think we should really be drawing our attention to as a success here and an opportunity.
One framework that Eric Gordon writes a lot about is what he calls a meaningfully inefficient process. So rather than focus on efficiency as the kind of end goal for this thing, how can we make processes that are deliberately inefficient, but the outcome of that process is creating this kind of stronger social infrastructure around it. So this project has been almost, we did this process last summer, so it's been a year. And through that, I've been able to meet these incredible people. I've learned so much about mass incarceration and society in general. Emerson College is right next to a bunch of homeless shelters and recovery centers. So, I walk through the streets differently now. So I think it's really important to think about if, in working in these kinds of highly political areas, what is our role as privileged XR creators and researchers in these problems. And so for me, one huge lesson is thinking about this narrative of VR as this empathy machine. Where are the limits of empathy? I could never really empathize with someone who's been through incarceration or reentry or any of the kind of life paths that lead to that. sorry, I won't say never, because it could happen to anyone, but a large part of it, I think it's really important that we recognize the limits of empathy. And where empathy ends, I think we need to think about how do we build really trusting relationships with people that we're creating media for and with. And so I know I've learned so much from people on this team and the small village of people we've been able to create around this project. So we have around 16 minutes. Do any of you want to add any more before we open it up for questions?
I think just a couple of things that this video is a little bit different from other, maybe some other things out there, is that we had the focus groups, so we had the inmates involved in creating this. This wasn't me, it wasn't any of us in our office saying, this is what they were thinking, this is what they would do. It was actually the women who came up with this and created the script. So I think that's very unique. And having the internal dialogue on the video was fabulous, because we teach that in groups while they're incarcerated. You gotta sort of have that internal dialogue and remember and take a breath and just think about all your options. And so that makes it a little bit unique as well. And this wouldn't be successful, certainly, without that human element. Watching the video is terrific. I'd love to have a library of these videos in every prison, but you have to have that element of a group. You need that group discussion to bring it all together. I think that's very important.
Thank you. Okay. Questions? Someone is, thank you.
There's a few questions.
I'm not sure. So we have
she's got a hand around the
mics, I think, on both sides, and runners.
Okay, so I had a question.
Thank you.
Yeah, so this is absolutely fascinating, and I've got tremendous respect for the amount of work that's gone into this creation of that short video. Because where a lot of these things fall down is there's just not the input from the people that are going to potentially benefit from it, like you were saying. Have you done any work with outcomes, or do you plan to do any work with outcomes that'll tell you how the women fare who have and have not seen the video?
Yes, we have pre and post tests that we've developed for this pilot program. We're hoping to build this program into much bigger than what it is now and look at lots of different things. For instance, if they recidivate, or if while they're still incarcerated, are they receiving disciplinary reports? Are they following through on their plans once they're released? Are they going to that recovery home? How are they doing with probation? How are they doing with parole? Those are down the road, but hopefully, yes, because in this pilot program, the women and their experience, and just like Melissa said, what would take weeks and weeks to get to, took just minutes to get to. And to be able to have that group cohesiveness and really dive into this material was fascinating. So yes, we do hope to go that route.
There's some raised hands.
Hi. Just to expand on that, so in VR and XR, feedback loops are extremely important to get all the data in order to really understand what's helping, what's not, what's working, what's not. So out of the five women that you guys worked with, it was 5, have they re-entried? Were those moments that you chose helpful to them? Were they able to actually not have the anxiety that ultimately could have caused major sources of anxiety? Did you get that feedback at this point?
Out of the 5 women that have participated in it, one is being released next week. They all said the VR project was amazing and the best program that they've done since being incarcerated, because it was so real and brought them right to where they will ultimately be someday, walking out of parole. Whether it's parole, you can take that to probation, you can take that to lots of different places. So none of them have been released at this point, and there's only 5. We're ready to get the next 10 in tomorrow. We're ready to go with this.
Maybe, I know you had a good story about kind of the mechanic of the tapping and the following along with, that might be a valuable story here.
Sure.
Just in that feedback.
On the feedback loop, yeah. I mean, in terms of larger study, we haven't done that yet. I mean, part of that is a resource constraint. But in terms of smaller feedback loops, just for design, the way that we had the group set up is you have a partner. So it's supposed to be 6 people, 3 pairs. And one person is watching the video, and the other person has the script in front of them because we have it all written out. And you can, we use the Oculus Go, so some of the audio leaks through. So as someone is watching, their partner's following along on the script, and every time they feel like something was activating for them, we ask them to tap their finger on the desk. And their partner would mark that point of the script. So the idea was that you would leave the session with a personalized set of activating moments for yourself to reflect on afterwards. What we found was that in practice, some people were so nervous and shaky that their partner couldn't tell when they were actually tapping their finger, so we had to change it to raising their hand instead. So these are just smaller feedback loops for changing our design. Yes.
It's kind of like a 2-part question. Either one's kind of fine. From the perspective of like an inmate or someone's going through this session, like how repeatable was that? Like, can they go back to the same scenario and kind of keep watching it over and over again, or do it again as they progress? And in either case, is there any, I guess, ideas or for like doing a progressive development, like for different scenarios to kind of enhance it further down the line, or like support it in the other way, kind of like, pick your own story kind of a thing where they choose the best path for them, like adaptive, emotional scenarios?
Maybe you can talk about that, Lynn. So
The repeatability.
So first question was for people who've done saw the same video twice, what changed?
So the first bit, the video here, Temptation, they all watched it at least twice. A couple people wanted it, 2 of them wanted to watch it a 3rd time. And they're able to do that. We wouldn't want them just to watch the video without us being there in a group, but they certainly can watch it a couple times. The first time they watched it, a lot of them said that they missed most of the video. They're frozen. They were just, and then the second time they watched it, this was really interesting. The second time they watched it, they're real anxious before, and they weren't quite sure what to expect, if they were going to be really anxious again. They watched it, and when they took off the Oculus Go, they said it wasn't as bad. So they learned. And then 2 of them that did it a 3rd time said, all right, it's getting easier for me to take a pause, to take a break and think about what I'm going to do. So yes, they can watch it multiple times.
To answer your second question, I've gotten to do some work where we did some perspective shifting as kind of a exposure training. And we worked with big tech companies and HR teams, and of course they're very adept at using the Oculus Go controllers or whatever controller is in front of them, or at least they're able to quickly understand how all the controls work and how to make choices in those environments. And in this case, it felt like we really wanted to find the easiest, the sort of like lowest barrier to entry for people to experience these stories, and having to teach them how to use a controller, how to make choices, how to get back, how to exit, all those things just add a layer that takes you out of the story you're trying to watch in this case. So that's one of the reasons we picked a linear path, and also there's budget constraints, so you can't make 6 movies and call it 1. But I think that there's real value actually in linear storytelling with populations that aren't as exposed to gaming controllers and different mechanics for making choices in these environments.
Just to add on to that really quickly, we also notice there's there can be so much anxiety in just putting on a headset for people who are inside because, you know, some of them might have lived their whole life needing to look over their shoulder, watch their back, you know, so we had to be really cautious about the setting in which they're actually putting on the headset. So we chose the linear storytelling in part because it's a low barrier of entry also.
What sort of considerations or even feedback have you received from organizations in the community that do work with reentry and potentially expanding this type of pilot there?
Yeah, we have, well, so what's nice is they were kind of part of the design process from the start. So they were really integral into the actual designing of this. So currently so that's actually how I met Jennie. I found Moving Steps Foundation online, I reached out, and then got to invite or work with some of their incredible dancers and actors in the design process. So it wasn't a surprise when they saw the product. But we have reached out to the city of Boston, and so what I find is for people who've never experienced this, they're like, oh, that's nice. It's a good quality video. For people who have that memory, they're like it evokes so many memories. So for people who work with people who are reentering society, they're like, I see the application. I want to know how I can fold this into my work. Because for a lot of these organizations, they're not super well funded. They don't have technological capacity normally. So for them to integrate this into their workflow is really exciting for them. So I've been talking with this organization called the Transformation Center. They practice peer support recovery, similar to like the Alcoholics Anonymous model, where you're in a group of people with shared experience. And they are really interested in the facilitation aspect. So VR is really powerful at evoking these emotions. How do you pair that with really good facilitation where people feel like, okay, now I feel safe enough to, accept or address these emotions and then try to unpack them in a group of people with shared experiences? I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
How was it financed, and going forward, are there any other sources of income?
Sources of income? No. It's all the media is Creative Commons. It was funded. Microsoft gave us $5,000 seed funding, so that largely paid for Barry.
Yeah.
Luckily, Emerson is a communication school, so we had some VR equipment we could borrow, and then, yeah, and Barry
It was a shoestring operation.
Gave us an alum discount.
Mostly in flights and hotels, honestly. But I think there is, as I mentioned, just a real opportunity for funders, for big companies, for big brands to get behind projects like this. There's no reason we shouldn't be making the world a better place with VR. It's just, there's a gap in that and sort of the vision of what we fund and why.
Right. I will say one regret I have is that we weren't able to, Moving Steps has a model where all the dancers are paid professionally, so I do wish that we could have paid.
It's okay.
I know you do too. Sorry. Yeah.
Just to have this experience and just showing the world that it's like, no matter what happens, like, just stay positive and keep moving, self-confident. It's really important to have. And I feel like I've learned a lot from this whole entire project. And being obviously in prison, I never want to go back. So all the choices that I make now, I'm a bit more cautious about things and just to understand the repercussion that it can happen to you, to anybody. So.
I want to say thank you. It's very exciting work. I'm curious from a researcher perspective, working with, I'm not sure if technically this would be considered a vulnerable population, but we know that this is a vulnerable population. Can you share a little bit about structuring the research, given that it has participatory aspects to it, and how a little bit of the structuring of things are, whether that's how IRB is structured, or making sure that there's this, like how consent works, because I think more and more researchers should be doing this kind of work, and that could be valuable to the community to know a little bit about that.
Sure, I can tell you about the IRB process.
or not just IRB, but also how to, what's it step by step by working with people who may be in vulnerable states to make sure that they are cared for in the process, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great question. For context, our IRB process took half a year. It's really important because which means it was 6 months of ethnography research on my part, before I stepped foot in a prison to talk with the women inside. I think for researchers, it's really important to do your due diligence and know what you're getting into, and to be able to, so concretely, like background research, literature reviews of existing projects that are similar. So in this case, other, oh sorry, we're out of time. I'll be really quick. Other participatory action research projects that have taken place in prison, other arts-based programs that have happened in prison, and then interviewing and talking with people who have lived through incarceration, presenting your workshop designs to them, getting their feedback. And I mean, we talked with Lynn a lot. We ran everything by Lynn to make sure it was okay based on their culture. But yeah, doing as much as possible to prepare yourself. And I think most importantly, to talk with people who have actually gone through the experience. And reflecting on your internal, biases as well. I think we're out of time. Thank you. Thank you.